Imagine this. A 10-year-old girl walks home from a neighborhood talent show. It's a warm summer night in Cleveland, 1951. She's shy, careful, the kind of child who never talks to strangers. Witnesses see her take the shortcut across the park. And then she's gone. No scream. No trace. Not a single clue left behind. Hours later, her parents beg for her safe return. Days turn to weeks, the entire city searching, suspects questioned, confessions whispered on deathbeds. But Beverly Potts never comes home. To this day, what happened to her that night remains one of the most chilling mysteries in American history. Was it a neighbor, a drifter, or someone who kept the truth buried for decades? Before we dive deeper to uncover what really happened to Beverly, hit subscribe for more chilling mysteries. The night Beverly Potts vanished began like any late August evening in a quiet Cleveland neighborhood. The air still and warm, the kind of summer stillness that makes even the faint scrape of bicycle spokes sound loud. Beverly, 10 years old and small for her age, had eaten supper, washed dishes for a nickel, and then, with the cheeriest permission from her mother, set off with her best friend Patricia swing to the Showagon, a traveling children's talent show that rolled into Halloran Park every summer. The park was fewer than 5 minutes from Beverly's house on Linnet Avenue, a short walk through streets shaded by maples and chestnuts. She carried nothing more than the night on her face and the easy confidence of a child who belonged to her neighborhood. The Showagon was loud with laughter and amateur songs. A flatbed truck turned into a stage beneath a canopy of streetlights. Families spread blankets. Neighborhood children performed silly routines, and the evening folded into the kind of gentle celebration that had knit communities together for generations. Beverly and Patsy arrived on their bicycles, left the bikes parked near the edge of the crowd, and settled in to watch. They left and returned earlier that night, a routine that must have seemed ordinary to everyone there. And finally, when the show ended around 9:30, the 1,000 or so people who had gathered began drifting home. The route Beverly would have taken cut diagonally across the park, past the emptying amphitheater and into Linnet Avenue, a narrow avenue where only a handful of street lamps pierced the dark. It was a route that should have taken her minutes. Instead, it became the last stretch anyone saw her alive. What the neighborhood remembered, what became the first stubborn fact the world had to accept, was how quickly ordinary life turned into something else. A 13-year-old boy named Fred Krause, pedaling past the park, later told police he thought the girl he saw walking across the lawn in the dark was Beverly. He recognized her by a peculiar walk, a toe-turned gait the other kids teased as duck-footed. That sighting, one of the clearest threads of the night, anchored the timeline. Beverly walking alone, moving the shortest way home. She never reached her doorstep. When Beverly's mother and father discovered their daughter was not home by 10, the panic unfurled like a bruise. They called Patricia's house and learned Patsy had gone home alone much earlier. She'd left while Beverly remained behind. What began then was a frantic, methodical search that grew and grew. Neighbors fanning out under lamplight, voices calling names into alleys and between trees, windows thrust open to the warm night. Her bicycle sat in the garage. Her piggy bank still held the nickel she'd been given that evening. No footprints, no whisper of a struggle, no lint, and no note. The family called the police at 10:57. Officers arrived before midnight and the city mobilized. They combed the park and the streets with flashlights and dogs. They hunted across the neighborhoods and over the lawns, as if the light itself might reveal the answer. It did not. What makes a disappearance, like Beverly's Lodge in the public mind, is not only the mystery, but the human detail, the small routines of a life interrupted. Beverly was described as a shy, obedient child who had been warned to be careful with strangers. Her parents told reporters she would never leave willingly with someone she didn't know. That belief hardened into a terrible certainty. If she was gone, she had been taken. Headlines spun frames of fear. The Cleveland press and radio stations pulsed with updates. Within a week, the FBI had distributed thousands of circulars and the family endured hundreds, then thousands, of tips, a litany of hope and hoax that stretched across the country. The police followed leads until their lamps were dim. None brought Beverly back. Rumors always feed on absence. In the months after the disappearance, reports surfaced. Sightings of a girl in the back seat of a speeding car, a dark coupe idling near Linnet Avenue, a tawdry shadow of men seen talking in the park. One witness claimed she'd seen a dark coupe barreling north with a girl in the back, hands bound. Another recalled a conversation, the kind of small observation that might mean nothing except in the hollow left behind by the missing. The community sifted those notes like embers, trying to coax a full shape from them. Police pursued each in turn. Detectives interviewed dozens, tested alibis, examined cars and histories. Names were crossed out, then underlined again. Investigators suspected foul play from the outset, but never found the final proof. The silence became the hardest evidence of all. The years folded over the case like pages turning. Suspects emerged and receded. William Ross Slates, a young ex-serviceman who had been living near Halloran Park, was questioned. He had a troubling past, an earlier arrest for making advances toward a child. He left town abruptly after the disappearance, and then returned under a cloud. A polygraph raised eyebrows. Yet nothing concrete tied him to Beverly. Another man, Frank Dale Davis, would make headlines for another reason. He tried to extort money from Beverly's family months later, claiming he had the girl and demanding a ransom. That call led to an undercover sting in Davis's arrest, but Davis eventually admitted the extortion was a lie. He had no connection to Beverly's disappearance. The extortion was a cruelty of its own, a fresh hurt on top of an original wound, but it did not solve what had happened that August night. When you read the ledger of the investigation, the walls plastered with photos, the reporters' transcripts, the pile of statements, you can feel the strain of a city that could not stop looking. Volunteers, police, the federal agents, Boy Scouts and neighborhood kids walked the creek beds and empty lots. Newsreel footage and grainy photographs of Beverly, her straight bangs and steady eyes, were pinned in shop windows. Citizens offered their basements, their metal detectors. Some even promised to dig where they believed a body might be. But the land kept it secret. Bodies of water were searched and sluices drained. Every possibility was considered, that she'd wandered off and been lost in a ravine, that she'd been taken to another city, that she'd been murdered and hidden beneath a foundation. Many theories arrived with fervor, none held. The parents' public plea, raw with grief and the hardened edge of exhausted hope, is one of the case's most human images. A week after Beverly's disappearance, Robert and Elizabeth Potts told the abductor in no uncertain terms, that they had accepted the terrible likelihood that Beverly was not coming home alive. They asked instead for the return of her body so she could be buried properly. A parent's desire for a coffin and closure is as practical as it is heartbroken. Without a body, there can be no ritual, no ending. Their plea was not a plea for the child alive. It was an attempt to reclaim some small measure of dignity amid the absurdity of the unknown. No response came. Over the decades, every new lead was a shock and a reprieve and then, almost invariably, a disappointment. In the early 1980s, detectives followed a long, tantalizing tip. A man allegedly admitted to involvement in Beverly's abduction while intoxicated. Investigators dug into the claim, interviewed his acquaintances, chased any corroboration. Nothing held up in court. The prosecuting office declined to press charges. There were other confessions, some from drifters who craved attention, some from men whose tales collapsed under scrutiny. One man told police he had killed Beverly and shown investigators where he had left her body, only to later recant or prove unreliable. Each false lead reopened the family's wound. Each dead end asked the same cold question: what happened the night a child took the shortest path home and disappeared? There is a long sorrow to cases like this, how they ripple through the lives of neighbors and of a city. Parents in Cleveland tightened rules. Neighborhood children were watched differently. The freedom of those little feet on quiet streets receded. Beverly's disappearance became shorthand for the danger parents feared. the ill-wind parents warn against when they tell their own kids not to talk to strangers. Her sister Anita lived with a loss for a lifetime, a quiet monument to a life always missing its younger sibling. She moved away, married, had children, but she never stopped hoping the truth might surface. Years later, she placed a memorial stone beside their parents' graves, with a hollow at its center for Beverly's remains, should they ever be found. There is a stubborn, human insistence in that gesture, a family's refusal to let the story erode into a footnote. Decades later, investigators still revisited the case, if only to try any new method that might unlock the past. Advances in forensic science promised answers for many cold cases. DNA that could link a hair to a suspect, or modern analysis of old evidence. But Beverly's case offered nothing physical enough for modern tools to grasp. Letters arrived across the years. Hoaxes, cruel jokes of the sort that exploit grief. One anonymous writer vowed to reveal himself on the 50th anniversary, then wrote again to say he could not because he had been institutionalized. Others sent in tips that led nowhere. Some prompted police to reopen files, interview witnesses who were tired from having been asked the same questions for 30 years. Even with new techniques available, the greatest problem remained the same: the absence of a body and hard forensic traces. The case collected a patience that would not be rewarded. Perhaps the most chilling thing about an unsolved disappearance is how unremarkable the circumstances were. Beverly had been to a neighborhood event. She had been seen by people who knew her, by a friend who left early, by a paperboy who recognized her gait. She had left nothing behind that explained away her absence. That normality, a walk through a park under street lamps, makes the disappearance more than a crime. It is a rupture of faith in the everyday. It forces an entire place to recalibrate how safe it feels. The cumulative effect is subtle but enduring. Games move inside. Curfews arrive earlier. Windows are checked more often. The city keeps a memory of that night like a scar. True crime histories can be indulgent in drama, but the facts of Beverly's case carry their own dark poetry. The images that return most often are small and blunt. A flatbed stage under a sky, a girl with bangs and denim jeans waiting for the show to end, a dark coupe idling where it should not have been, parents who could not sleep, and a house that kept its child's bicycle in the garage as if waiting for her return. There is brutality in that small geography. The idea that someone could take a child who had been raised carefully, who was known to be shy and obedient, remains an affront to the sense of order neighborhoods like Beverly's depended upon. In the years since 1951, the case has become a fixture of Cleveland's collective memory, a cautionary tale and a wound. Writers and documentarians return to it, trying to stitch a narrative out of stubborn fragments. A 2004 documentary drew on interviews with those left behind. Journalists have written features. The newspapers marking August anniversaries with sober retrospectives. The city's archives keep the yellowed clippings, the police reports, and the photographs that community members insist be preserved, as if the presence of the paper could ward off the finality of loss. The case is taught in some circles as an example of the limits of mid-century investigations, the way public hysteria could compete with methodical detective work, how resources sometimes fell short despite an outpouring of volunteer energy. Even now, the possibility that Beverly might have been taken to another city or even another state, and hidden in the steady blur of post-war mobility, haunts the imagination. The 1950s were an era when cars could take you away from everything in a single hour, when someone with a plan might fade into highways and new names. It is easy to imagine how the pieces of a life might be smuggled into other lives, how a child might grow under an assumed identity. But that imagining is an unstable bridge between hope and cruelty. The facts offer no scaffold to walk across, no traceable DNA, no confessed killer whose story matched the small, essential details the family remembered. What remains are eyewitness accounts, conflicting and occasionally contradictory, and a city that learned the vocabulary of uncertainty young and kept learning it. The years wrote their own ending for the Potts family, Elizabeth Potts' health declined, and she died in 1956, 5 years after her daughter vanished. Robert survived until 1970, found dead in his living room, a solitary end that some whispered had been hastened by grief. Anita, Beverly's sister, carried the mystery the rest of her days, raising children with a quiet insistence that safety is not an entitlement but a practice. She marked her sister's absence with a stone, a place to keep the possibility that someday, somehow, the truth might be returned. The stone is, in a way, both a memorial and a challenge. Find what was lost, or at least show where it lies. The city did not, and has not. So what do we have left to tell us what happened? We have the evening itself, reconstructed from witness fragments. The show, the bikes, the route across the park. We have Krause's sighting, the account of a girl walking alone. We have reports of vehicles, of men who shouldered suspicion and then stepped away from it. We have the extortion attempt that teased the family's rawest vulnerability. We have the police reports, the thousands of calls, and the long years that tapered into decades of unresolved grief. We have the absence, the single unbearable fact of a 10-year-old LD who walked from a neighborhood carnival and simply did not come home. Those facts are stark enough to be cruel. That absence is also a demand. It asks for attention from the curious, the journalists, and the patient investigators to keep turning over every stone. It insists that memory not erode under convenience. Cases like Beverly survive because people refuse to let them go. Relatives who age and pass their memories to new generations. Reporters who mark anniversaries. Cold case units that revisit old files when new techniques make it sensible. Even if a final answer never comes, the act of searching itself is an insistence that the disappeared not be reduced to a date on a press clip. It is an attempt at justice where justice in its usual forms failed. To remember, to ask, to make sure that a life once lived does not become merely a rumor. And so the city keeps that August night as one of its hard, private truths. People who were children then tell their children. Remember Beverly Potts. Teach safety. Watch curfews a little closer. Listen when someone mentions a dark coupe idling near a park. Such oral rituals do not solve crimes. They are, however, how communities try to keep each other from living in the same blind trust that allowed an ordinary walk to become a lifelong silence. Beverly's story, so ordinary in gesture and so extraordinary in consequence, remains a caution and a lament. It is the uneasy knowledge that the smallest things are sometimes the most fragile, and that, in a single breath, ordinary life can be supplanted by permanent, unanswered grief. If you stand at Halloran Park today, under summer leaves and tempered lamps, you can imagine that night. Laughter spilling from a flatbed stage, a child brushing by, the hush that follows when a family discovers emptiness. The image refuses comfortable endings. It asks us to hold both the normal and the terrible in mind at once. A 10-year-old LD who loved neighborhood shows and the black, ordinary fact that she walked home and never arrived. That double image, the life and the absence, is what makes Beverly Potts' story resist the tidy resolutions we crave. It remains, in the city's memory and in the archives of cold cases, a small, stubborn ache that has no safe end. If there is any final plea embedded in recounting such a story, it is this. Keep looking. New technologies, fresh eyes, a remembered detail suddenly recalled could still yield answers. For the Potts family that would never come home, any revelation would not restore what was lost. No discovery ever could, but it would give a name larger than silence to the shape of that loss. It would allow a family to lay a child to rest with the dignity every parent deserves. That small human desire for a body, a name, a place, is what turns an old cold case into a continual moral obligation. The night Beverly Potts vanished left a city altered. The slightest new fact could yet bring it, however belatedly, toward something like an ending. They kept looking. Even when hope had long since withered into routine sorrow, someone, a cop who wouldn't quit, a neighbor who could not forget the shape of her bangs, would pick the file back up. New technology arrived with its promises and disappointments. Men who'd once been suspects died with their secrets, And those who'd been silent for decades sometimes loosen their tongues in the last, private hours of life. One such moment arrived like a small, jagged gift, a confession whispered in a hospital room, between the steady beeps of a monitor and the rustle of cheap paper sheets. The man had been a drifter for most of his life, known casually to a handful of OLD timers, as a loner who worked at odd hours and drove an old car that coughed like a throat clearing. He had never been arrested for anything significant in the neighborhood. His offenses were the kind that don't make headlines: a brawl in a bar, an accusation that could not be substantiated. But he carried, for reasons nobody could later explain, a private weight. On his deathbed, the weight tipped. He called in a detective who had spent half a career trailing cold shadows and said 3 words that made the detective's hands go cold. "I took her." He did not say where. He did not explain why. He coughed up a detail, a peculiar ring he'd once owned with an engraving of a tiny star, and the detective found a faded photograph in a drawer, a picture of that ring on the hand of a younger man in a summer jacket. It was not proof. It was a thread that could not be pulled taut enough to knot into a case. That confession, like so many others, landed on the scale of truth and falsehood and teetered there. The man's story could not be corroborated. He had been known to drink to the point of invention. The details he offered were inconsistent when pressed. But the admission did something else. It forced the Potts family and the city to stare at a face that had the possibility of guilt. It made the unknown one step more particular and, for a time, made the grief even harder to bear because it suggested that somewhere, someone had known and had never said. Guilt unconfessed is a different cruelty than guilt that is prosecuted. It implies choice and a long, private calculus. The city held a new image, then, of a man who might have decided, in a moment, to take the life of a child and never look back. It was almost worse than the idea of a stranger, because a neighbor could be, and often is, the kind of person a community trusts. Other leads were quieter, folded inside ordinary objects. An old highway map with a penciled route to a rusted service station. A box of Polaroids showing a girl who might be smiling, but whose chin might also be the tilt of someone entirely different. Each item produced hours of scrutiny, a brief reopening of the wound. Journalists wrote anniversary pieces that sifted old testimony, and podcast producers interviewed surviving witnesses who told their stories with the softer cadence age gives memory. None of it extracted a conclusive answer. The case collected attention like dust, visible when light hit it just so, otherwise barely there. What made the 30th and 40th and 50th anniversaries especially cruel for the Potts family was that ritual of public remembrance. Candles at the park, tentative speeches, the same faces older and grayer. Each August, Halloran Park filled with people who wanted to mark what had been lost. Children who'd been toddlers then came back as adults with their own children in tow, and the story traveled forward in a kinds of oral liturgy. Don't take the shortcut through the park. Don't let kids roam alone after dark. Those lessons, repeated until they were almost mechanical, were the social detritus of a violent, unresolved absence. There were moments in the investigation that suggested the truth might be simple and ugly rather than conspiratorial and vast. The dark coupe, mentioned by multiple witnesses in the earliest days, became symbolic. It was the thing neighbors pointed to when they wanted to make sense of what had happened. A car at the margin of an event, idling as human beings flowed past it, anonymous against the crush of a crowd. Cars are how many vanishings happened in the 1950s. Quick, efficient itineraries away from small, trusting places where children played without fear. To imagine that car leaving with a child aboard is to imagine a normal night ending in an extraordinary violence that leaves nothing in its wake but absence. And yet, here is the chilling thing about absences. They can harbor entire lives. One of the loneliest possibilities is that a child taken without fanfare might have been folded into another home, taught to answer to a new name, cooled into adult life under an assumed identity. The decades become a second disappearance, not merely the child's vanishing from a family, but the slow erasure of the shape of who she once was. It is a possibility the Potts family had to live alongside, less final than death, but at times more unbearable because it leaves open every cruel permutation. Could Beverly have lived under another name? Could she have married, had children, and never known the history that birthed her? Each possibility is a hollow, and none can be filled without the fossil evidence of fact. In the end, the most dreadful thing was the ordinary geometry of it. A little girl walking home through a park, protected by nothing but the assumption that the world was mostly kind. That assumption is what crime takes when it triumphs. IT eats away at social quiet and replaces it with suspicion. The final act of the story, then, is not a courtroom, not a confession that perfectly ties every loose end. The final act is a slow, inexorable reconfiguration of a community's self-image. Parents lock doors they once left open. Children learn to fear the dark. A bench that had been for shared laughter becomes a place of vigil. And every empty bicycle in a garage is, in some small way, a shrine. On the last page of this telling, there is a single, small image I cannot forget. A child's sock, folded precisely, left beneath a sycamore by someone who had known Beverly. It was the kind of token people leave when they believe that memory needs physical anchors. A way to say, we remember you in the smallest ways. The sock was not evidence. It was prayer material. It was an object aimed at the impossible, a demand that the world not let her evaporate into rumor. There will be those who want a definitive end, the easy pleasure of closure. But not every story permits that mercy. Some stories end with the world keeping its question. Beverly's story gives us no neat solution. IT leaves a street lamp still glowing on Linnet Avenue, the flatbed truck long gone, and a neighborhood that learned to live with a space where a laugh should be. The hardest truth is that sometimes the only answer we ever get is the echo of what was. The memory of a girl who loved shows and nickels, and the tiny freedom of a summer night. If there is a lasting justice in such endings, IT is this: memory sustained. It is the refusal to let her name be swallowed by time. In telling Beverly's story, in speaking her name aloud on anniversaries and in small gatherings, the community resists the ultimate theft, that of forgetting. That resistance does not bring her home. It does not return the life taken, nor does it unmake the harm. But it insists that the absence be witnessed, and human beings are, in their last ethical move, the ones who bear witness. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the next unsolved mystery. Thanks for watching.